You remember Din Ben Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rifle. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on.
Hello and welcome to a Guerrilla History and Revolutionary Left crossover episode. Guerrilla History is the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm one of the co-hosts of Guerrilla History, Henry Hakamaki, joined by both of my co-hosts of the program, Professor Adnan Husain, historian and director of the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada. Hello, Adnan. How are you doing?
Hi, Henry. I'm well. It's good to be with you.
Yes, nice to see you as always. And also joined by my other Guerrilla History co-host, who is, of course, Breht O'Shea, host of Revolutionary Left Radio and co-host of the Red Menace podcast. Now, I mentioned that this was a Guerrilla History Rev Left crossover episode, and we're talking about some breaking news that just came out today. So without further ado, Breht, since this is a crossover episode, let me just turn it over to you now, and you can take it and run with it as far as you want.
Sure. Yeah. So just to set up the situation, we have a leaked document from the Supreme Court, which is very rare. Leaks in general are sort of commonplace, but leaks out of the Supreme Court are exceedingly rare. And this leak is basically a 98-page draft opinion from the conservative Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, basically laying out the full conservative judicial argument to dismantle Roe v. Wade. And what Roe v. Wade does is, of course, secure women's bodily autonomy and their reproductive rights as a constitutional right. And that now is being attacked and dismantled. Now, while this is only a draft and no law has been made yet, no strike down of the constitutional right to an abortion has happened yet, we've known this is building for a while. We know the entire point of conservative judicial world is to get enough conservatives onto the Supreme Court so that at some point they could overturn Roe v. Wade. This has been a very long process in the making. But it seems very likely that in the next month or two, the official decision will come out. Today, just as the draft leaked, they put huge barrier fencing around the Supreme Court itself. And I think that tends to speak volumes. So we're having a situation in which a right that we've had our entire lives, that we've functionally taken for granted as a constitutional right that cannot be dislodged, is being dislodged, is being dismantled. And that puts tens of millions, hundreds of millions of women over a generation or two in a really precarious position. What would effectively happen is that the constitutional right would be eradicated and the states would be left to decide what to do. Now, many red states have trigger laws, meaning that the moment the constitutional right to an abortion gets dismantled, laws will automatically come to the governor's desk, be signed, and go into law. So you don't have to wait for the entire legislative process to take its turn. Functionally in red states, virtually all the deep red states, including the one I'm living in and surrounded by, it will be illegal for women to get an abortion. And so this is going to set off an interesting state of events, state of affairs, and a cascade of events. The big question for me is, what will the response be? Is the response going to be divided, weak? Is the left going to just post about it online, maybe hold some signs up at some rallies while they laugh in our face and take away women's rights? Or is the resistance going to be a little bit more robust? I think I'll toss it over to each of you after that summary to kind of get your opening thoughts. I clearly have much more to say, but that's the basic situation taking place right now. And so we wanted to jump on the mic and kind of think through this event as it's unfolding.
Yeah, I can go in now and just lay out a little bit more of the background of the current situation before we turn to Adnan for his initial thoughts on this. So, of course, as Breht mentioned, Roe versus Wade was the court decision. It's been around for 49 years now at this point, that has codified the right to an abortion in the United States. There was also a subsequent decision in 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that also in large part maintained all of those rights, but really we're talking about 1973 being the modern era of abortion rights in the United States. Interestingly, one of the arguments that was made in this leaked, and again, as Breht mentioned, it's not usual for leaks to happen. This is actually the first draft decision in the modern history of the Supreme Court that has been leaked while the case was still pending. So one of the justifications that has been given for this decision that they're going imminently to be making, why they're going to be overturning it, is that the right to an abortion was not written in the Constitution, which is a very interesting explanation, because by that explanation, like anything that was not written in the Constitution when the Constitution was written would not have any sort of protection given by the Supreme Court. It's a very strange argument. But also, given that when the Constitution was signed, abortion was not illegal, it makes it even more strange. Like, this is something that a lot of people don't understand, is that when we think about, the good old days of the late 1700s, that people were incredibly anti, abortion in every potential sense of the word, like in all cases, absolutely appalled at the idea. But it wasn't illegal. Like, it wasn't codified in any laws in the United States that abortion was illegal. You wouldn't be criminalized for conducting an abortion, for having an abortion performed. It was really only in the kind of early to mid 1800s that we started to see this push for anti-abortion legislation. So even if you want to say, well, they didn't actually write into the Constitution that there's protection for abortion, at the same time, there was no laws against abortion, either in the Constitution or outside of the Constitution. Like, these things did not exist in the United States at this point. But there are a few points of this draft that I wanted to read through very quickly, because I think that they're quite interesting, and they really say a lot into the mind of Samuel Alito, who is, of course, one of the most psychotically conservative members of the Supreme Court. So I'll just go through this briefly, and I have some polling things that I want to talk about, and then I'll turn it over to Adnan and Breht. But I think that this might help us get a little bit of a grounding into the situation. So in this opinion of the court part of this leaked document, we see that it says, Roe's abuse of judicial authority. Roe was egregiously wrong from the start. Its reasoning was exceptionally weak, and the decision has had damaging consequences. And far from bringing about a national settlement of the abortion issue, Roe and Casey have inflamed debate and deepened division. Now, just hold on there, listeners, for 1 second. More about that in a little bit, I promise. It is time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elected representatives. Quote, the permissibility of abortion and the limitations upon it are to be resolved, like most important issues in our democracy, by citizens trying to persuade one another and then voting. Casey, 505 US, et cetera, et cetera. There's also one other section that if I can pull up my highlights, it would be very good. But my computer is being slow. In any case, we'll skip that other highlight for now because my computer is on its last legs at this point. But I wanted to say about this point of how Roe has deepened divisions within the United States. This is also another completely false argument. Support for Roe versus Wade has been broad for a very long time, decades, in fact. If we look at the latest polls, we see that the support for abortion rights in any cases, all or most cases, which is in all cases as well as in cases of rape or other coerced sexual activity or incest, things like this. The support for it was at 80% in a Gallup poll in May 2021, but it was already at 76% in 1975. Which was only 2 years after Roe versus Wade came out. Like, the vast majority of people wanted, at least in these exceptional situations, abortion to be legal. Even in the case of a new Pew Research Center poll that looked at what people think about all the right to have an abortion in all situations, they found it to be 59%. now. And in 1995, it was 60%, which is to say statistically insignificant. So the year I was born, the same amount of people supported the right to abortion as today. This is not a deepening of division over the right to abortion over the decades. We're seeing continued support for it. And this goes across, surprise, surprise, across political parties. Like, of course, there's more support among Democrats and independents than there is among Republicans, but even many Republicans support the right to abortions. We also see that there's age factors at play, like young people, people that are of reproductive age, have the highest level of support for Roe versus Wade and for the right to abortion, which perhaps is not surprising, but that is what we see. We see that people that are 18 to 29, we see 67% believe that it should be legal in all cases, whereas it goes all the way down to 53% of people that are between the ages of 50 and 64. In other words, people who are done having kids anyway. So just a little bit more background information that might help set us up. I'm going to pitch it over to Adnan now, unless Breht, you look like you might have something to say.
Just really quickly, in any case, was that last polling was under any circumstance?
Yes, in any circumstance.
So like a lot of reasonable people will support the basic right? But then they'll say like, well, in maybe third trimester, I'll drop off or I'll become more suspicious, whatever. So the fact that that's the high ratings of like in any situation ever, I bet if you added in some reasonable nuances, that would even go up even higher. But in any case, no matter how you slice the pie, it's majorities.
I would say that it would probably be within the legal framework that we have right now. So when they say within any case, it would be like not just in the exceptional circumstances of incest or rape. It would be like person wants to have abortion, they can have abortion, but not late third trimester abortion, which is already illegal, even with Roe versus Wade. Because, at that point, the child is basically viable outside of the womb on its own. So my assumption, and I haven't read through the actual polling questions that were given out with that poll, but my assumption is that when they're talking about any situation, they're talking about rape, incest, and just people wanting to have an abortion without having those what we would consider exceptional circumstances.
Fair point. I see. Okay.
Adnan, what are your initial thoughts?
Well, I guess while it is shocking and it has come out and it's really galvanizing a lot of attention, and hopefully, as Breht was remarking, we'll be watching to see, what kind of response there will be. Will there be a really significant organized response and movement to protect women's freedoms and equality in society? I think this is something that I'm not surprised that the court, given its current constitution and the effect of several new, very conservative justices in the Trump, appointed by the Trump administration, that this is on the docket. There have been these cases, trial balloons. This one has risen as far as the Supreme Court, this Mississippi versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. I'm forgetting the exact title of the group, but this case has come before them now as an opportunity when they have neither the presidency nor either of the two houses of Congress in conservative hands. The court is the place where proactive action will be taking place. So this, to me, is not a surprise. This is, of course, these people lied in their, judicial hearings and all of these, we get that, there's reasons to be outraged, but I suspected that this would be a goal in the near term to roll back this right. But I think if we look at it historically, I think, what strikes me about this is how rearguard this action seems in some ways. What it shows is that far-right conservatism is feeling a lot more confident right now as we head, into our political future. Things that looked like they might be off the table or were just used cynically for political organizing and fundraising, I have to say, really by both political parties, is now actually a target on the agenda because patriarchy is a fundamental plank of far-right conservatism. And so the modern, conservative movement really established itself. I mean, of course, it has its roots, deep roots in American history and culture. There was the Goldwater, era, but it really had kind of organizing strength around Roe v. Wade, which, even though it wasn't an unpopular opinion in the majority of American society, there are certain constituent groups around which the modern right built itself organizationally, in terms of funding, in terms of grassroots organizing. And that was impelled by Christian conservatives, outraged both Catholic and Protestant evangelical churches around Roe v. Wade, in the fraying of, basically what they considered the moral sort of fiber of American society in the post-60s cultural revolution. And so this is really the decisive shift away from a conservative movement that was principally around economic kinds of policy, small government, and all of that, into the territory of the culture war, which is really the foundation, it seems, for the modern right. So it'll be very interesting to see what the outcomes of this, will be. Is this going to galvanize people on the right to come out, and or is it going to galvanize people, on the left? It definitely, I think, will be important on the left. This is going to galvanize, I think, a real response. The question is whether this, rather. How can we say it, like audacious, kind of decision that just shows such contempt, for what had really become a settled right in society, how that's going to play. I think, it could be problematic, for, I think, Republicans who are slightly liberal, this could push, more people into voting, against cultural conservative candidates, the Trump. It could hasten, on some level, some of the divisions within the Republican Party that has increasingly formed itself around the Trump sort of base, but there could be more splits off in, like, the upper middle class suburbs. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays politically. So those are just some initial thoughts. But I think it is, it's quite momentous, I think, to think that. And it's interesting also, why was it leaked? Who leaked it? Now, there's going to be inquests into this. Justice Roberts has said that this isn't going to affect it, and that they're going to investigate. But I think it will affect, the outcome. I guess the second kind of point that I would say is that the decision, which I haven't had a chance, it's like a draft decision that's 98 pages, and we don't know the final shape of any decision because this is just a draft, but it clearly shows the outlines of the thinking of conservative justices. I haven't read the whole thing, but one thing I got, from this is very much trying to use democratic ideals to say that, this is going to go back to the states and we should allow democracy. I think it's an interesting point and an interesting, problem for us on the left, is that we have depended on, the court and these court decisions. One positive element out of this terrible tragedy is that perhaps it will galvanize democratic movements and organizing at the local and state levels. If this is going to be fought out there, it's something that we haven't seen real strength at the state and local levels on the left. We've paid too much attention in some ways to national party politics, and we've been sucked into the games that are played at the national and federal levels. But the basis for a revived left and social movements, whether it's going to be women's movements and feminist movements, anti-racism, movements on behalf of, people of color, and labor unions and unionizing and workers movements, is that it's going to have to take place at local levels of organizing. That's what we're starting to see in terms of labor, is a rejuvenated effort by workers to reclaim democracy in the workplace. And if that's what we have to do to secure our rights in a transformed society, then the one thing we should do is get organizing at those levels, because these are popular positions, and the entire left agenda is popular, broadly speaking, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to economic policy, when it comes to a lot of these social kinds of issues. We're actually, in the majority. It's just we haven't made that majority into a force on the ground and to give it political expression. So that's just the one lesson I would take from this, is that if they want to talk about, returning this to the states and democracy, then let us fight democratically as well.
Now, Breht, I know that you have a lot that you're going to want to say, but before I just unleash you and let you, raise hell for however long you want, let me just throw out a couple more things that might help rev you up a little bit for that. So I did find my other note in this initial draft that I had highlighted, and I referenced it earlier. We hold that Roe and Casey must be overturned. The Constitution makes no reference to abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision, including the one on which the defenders of Roe and Casey now chiefly rely, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. That provision has been held to guarantee some rights that are not mentioned in the Constitution, but any such right must be, quote, deeply rooted in this nation's history and tradition, end quote, and, quote, implicit in the concept of ordered liberty, end quote. So I already referenced that before, but since I found the quote again, I wanted to bring it up. Now, here's something else that I think might get your blood boiling a little bit more before I, let you go off, Breht, which is that this has Democrats, the people that are right now saying, why haven't you voted harder? If we only would voted harder, then this wouldn't be the situation that we're in right now. For decades, Democrats have had the opportunity to codify it into law that there is a right to an abortion, a right to abortion. And of course, for the majority of those decades, there was not the political capital and there was not the political ability to do so because of the obstruction that would have taken place from conservative Democrats, as well as, of course, Republicans. However, and this is something that we had put on our Twitter earlier today, I have a clipping from an article. It says, Democrats have attempted to codify the right to abortion before. In 2007, Barack Obama promised Planned Parenthood that the first thing I'd do as president would be to codify Roe versus Wade by signing the Freedom of Choice Act. But it fell by the wayside in 2009 when he said it was not his, quote, highest legislative priority. Now, you have to remember, at the beginning of Obama's first term, not only did he have the majority in both the House and the Senate, he had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate for 5 months. Now, 5 months might not seem like a lot, but he had been campaigning that this was going to be one of the first things that he did. It was right to an abortion and healthcare. We got Obamacare, which, is what it is. And I know that the listeners of this program have their thoughts about the ACA, Obamacare, most of which we share with you, of course. But also the other pillar, I guess he had two other pillars: close Guantanamo, which of course also didn't happen. But he also was campaigning quite heavily. Day one, I signed Roe versus Wade into law. And then immediately after being in office, he says it's not his highest legislative priority. That opportunity then falls by the wayside. And ever since then, the Democrats have just been telling us every election that the next election is the most important election in history, because if we lose it, we will lose the right to have an abortion, despite having the opportunity to do so in 2009. Okay, Brett, go ahead.
Yeah. So lots of points to make. On that point specifically, we have to understand why this is the case, because that is an issue that they can use to turn out their voters. It actually is a great, I'm not even being hyperbolic. It's a great thing for the Democratic Party machine to have Roe v. Wade overturned, because what they can do, just like what they did with Trump, is take a thing, put it in front of you and say, you have to vote for us if you care about this issue, whether it's, in years gone by, getting Trump out of office and fighting fascism, or in this case, it'll be like, we have to protect abortion rights. So we're not going to deliver anything materially for you. We're not going to give you healthcare, childcare, action on climate change, anything, unions, high wages, anything at all. But you have to vote for us if you care about women, right? And so they've used that forever. It's one of the reasons they didn't act on it, because having it out there as a possible issue that could be overturned is very helpful for them when they campaign. And its complete dismantling will be even more helpful for them to campaign. And you can already see the rhetoric gearing up from the Democratic Party machine. Why you have to vote for us. We'll never deliver anything for you. We won't even save your reproductive rights. But you got to vote for us because these guys are monsters. So that we're going to hear that all the time from here on out. So just keep that in mind and keep an eye out for that. The other thing is the question of democracy. And, I always talk about this because it's so central to the rhetoric of both the right and the left, but the liberals in particular. Save our democracy. We have to save our democracy, this precious democracy. Trump is a threat to democracy. January 6th is a threat to democracy. What we have here is a unelected, unaccountable set of judicial elites that have absolutely no responsibility to any citizen on lifetime appointments, meaning they cannot do anything that would get them kicked out of that position. Three of them put in there by the most unfavorable, now Biden's giving him a run for his money, but up to that point, the most unfavorable president in American history, put three people, stole one from Obama, and then put the other two on the court to take away a right that 70% in poll after poll, depending on how you word it, 60 to 80% of Americans across the political spectrum, as Henry said, support. There's nothing democratic about it. This is a fundamentally anti-democratic institution. The Supreme Court is. And I think we should make those points very clearly, that a bunch of theocratic freaks in black robes get to strip tens of millions of women of a human right. We can talk about constitutional rights and passing laws. I would frame this as a human right, because that is fundamentally what it is. And then I want to touch on this point about violence, because, I think in these days, violence gets overused. Like if you say something mean and it hurts my feelings, that's violence. But it's literally violence to forcefully strip women of this fundamental right, and their right to basically women's health care is being taken away from them. That is a violent act that will absolutely result in the brutalization and possibly even death of countless women if this is dismantled and it goes illegal in most red states. So that is an act of violence. What will our response be as an act of really self-defense against violence against women in our communities and our families, etc.? It can't just be, as I've said so many times, flag or sign waving, signing petitions and rage posting online. They laugh in our face if that's what it is. In 2020, the radical left chased police out of the Minneapolis police headquarters and burned it to the fucking ground. And the right, they stormed the Capitol because their preferred millionaire con man lost a bourgeois election. What is the left's response here? Because we have the people on our side. It is 100% like a average person on the street would be like, yeah, this is actually insane. And so it really is going to say a lot about the American left regarding what we can do in the face of this violent attack on women, which is how we should frame it and talk about it. There's also this deep fear on the Supreme Court in general of the delegitimization of that institution. There's been, they've come out, liberals, centrists, and right wingers on the court over the last year or two, trying to solidify this one institution really still works for people. This is still important. We have to support this, right? But the conservatives on the court are also, they're held by the throat because they came up through these processes and these institutions that meant to get them on the court specifically to overturn Roe v. Wade. So one of the other conservatives on the court You can overturn Roe v. Wade, and they probably will, but you're going to dramatically delegitimize that institution. Or you could strike that down, secure the rights of women, and re-legitimize. Conservatives are going to go in that direction because that's what their whole life is really geared toward. And so it's going to actually contribute to the delegitimization of yet another American institution. And you're talking about the prelude to radical activities or revolutions or collapses or civil wars, when institution after institution after institution becomes delegitimized in the average American's eyes. And that's happened on the right because they thought, Trump got the election stolen from him. On the left, even before, or not the left, the liberal center, blaming Trump's election on Russia, their conspiracy theorizing. It's all in service of the delegitimization of the very institutions that put those people in front of our faces and make them elites in the first place. So that's going to be an interesting process to see finally play out. And then the last thing I want to make is a point about class struggle, which is that, and this has been said in many times, is not a unique thought, but it's one worth reiterating. Rich women are going to be fine. You can travel to a different state. You can go to a blue state. You can get on your private jet, fly over here, go to a different country if you fucking want. This is an attack on working and poor women who don't have the opportunity to leave work for a week to travel across the country to get one of these things, let alone the money to be able to do it. And that those class dynamics are absolutely essential and need to be reinforced constantly. Even on this issue, there's a deep class divide. Okay, and the one last thing I want to say. First country ever in the history of the world to legalize abortion and make it free was the Soviet Union in 1920 under Lenin. And it took decades and decades and decades for the countries like America to catch up with that. And so again, on this socialist front, women's liberation has always gone hand in hand with the socialist experiments, and there is no socialism without women's liberation. That's been rearticulated from Sankara to Mao and everywhere in between. And so socialists and communists need to be the loudest, most militant and vociferous voices on this issue in defense of women's human rights. And I think we should harken back to the legacy of the socialist tradition, show how we've always been on the right side of this issue, even when liberals and conservatives and everyone else was on the wrong side of this issue, and strip this as much as we can, I think, away from the liberals and their grandstanding. Because as we've already pointed out in so many ways, the liberal elites in the Democratic Party got us here. They've used it cynically as a weapon to campaign on, and now their actions have consequences in the form of tens of millions of women losing a human right because they wanted to win some shitty elections that they didn't do anything with anyway. And so this is not a liberal, it's the left. This is the reason this is happening. Reject that, fight against it. This is 100%. It could have been stopped by the Democrats and the liberals. They chose not to for cynical, opportunistic reasons. And here we are. So do not let them take the moral high ground on this issue either.
I think that's a really important point. That analysis is excellent in my view, Breht. And just to return to that issue of the Democratic Party's cynical use of the issue, and the fact that, as Henry pointed out, that they had many opportunities to put it on the agenda and to embed this right in federal law, through democratic means by, passing and signing that bill. And part of the reason why is because, just as you identified, the way that they are planning to use this in upcoming elections and the cynical use of it to force us all to accept corporate establishment Democrats as a result of leveraging just this one kind of right that we must defend, but to leverage it in such a way that it allows them to fundraise, it allows them to galvanize, all kinds of support, and to suppress other aspects of a genuine left agenda, for the sake of securing this particular right, when they have abandoned really doing anything serious or significant about it and putting it on a different level in law when they had many opportunities to do so, and that they ran on it. And they've been running against the conservative court for many years now. In some ways, the chickens are, coming home to roost, but they may, try and exploit this, and particularly to fundraise around it. Now, I think
Adnan, let me cut you off for a second.
Go ahead.
I'll let you continue your thought in a second. But you mentioned fundraising. It's very interesting that you mentioned fundraising, because I have two specific examples of that right now. So I opened my email. I look in my email. What do I find? Earlier today, there was a mass email that went out from Nancy Pelosi. Hello, this is Speaker Pelosi, and this is my most important email to you ever. We're asking for money. because of the attack on Roe versus Wade. Now, the latest email that I just opened my email now, the most recent email that I have is not from a politician, but is from, your kind of liberal progressive media, Democracy Now! I have an email from Amy Goodman. Dear friend, dissent is essential to the functioning of a democratic society. You count on Democracy Now! For voices you won't hear anywhere else. Those raising deep questions about war and peace, demanding an end to our reliance on fossil fuels, fighting for reproductive rights, and calling for racial and economic justice around the world. Today, your tax-deductible donation to Democracy Now! Will be tripled by a generous donor. They're not an establishment outlet, but this plays really well for broad swaths of the liberal left, both within the Democratic Party as well as those adjacent to the Democratic Party. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I thought that it was interesting. You mentioned fundraising, and two of the more recent emails that I have, one's from Nancy Pelosi saying that Democrats need your money now more than ever, despite the fact that, of course, they're one of the richest institutions in the entire stinking country. And also we have media sources that are, not affiliated with the Democratic Party and in some ways are also critical of the Democratic Party, but have a liberal audience that it plays well to say, by donating to us, we will do what we can to protect the right to an abortion in our own way. Now, of course, folks, you can donate to us, but we're not asking for your money as a result of this. Like, we know that people aren't going to be donating to Guerrilla History today because of this obscene decision that has been leaked from the Supreme Court. But yeah, just an interesting aside. Anyway, Adnan, sorry for sidetracking.
Not at all. I mean, that's just a perfect illustration of how quickly all of this will fit into the partisan electoral politics that we, need to reframe in many of the ways that Breht was just talking about. And I think he's onto something here as well. I was thinking this could be a very unpopular decision by the court, given, majority, agreement, consensus on a women's right to choose. And so it does affect the legitimacy of the court in mainstream opinion. There already, as we know, recently in the last rounds of federal elections had been discussions about how the court could and needs to be reformed and to make it more democratic. I think it does open up in a more substantial and significant way possibilities for redefining, the judicial system potentially. It certainly at least definitely affects the sense of legitimacy of the institution as a whole. And that in itself can also fuel counter radical revolutionary politics. But I guess one other issue here that I'm interested in is that you keep hearing the opinion poll tested, I forget what are they, they've got those groups where they test sort of marketing phrases and things like that. These kind of political, consultants are always doing these kinds of things. And I think they have figured out that saying that abortion should be legal, safe, and rare is a kind of formulation that they think plays very well in marketing broadly the politics of supporting women's rights to choose. The Democratic Party, has done absolutely nothing, especially about the last component of it. If they were really interested in a women's agenda and wanted it to be rare in the sense that it's up to a woman to choose, why wouldn't you support Medicare for all, college for all, living wage, free childcare, pass the Equal Rights Amendment? I mean, there's a whole host of things that take the material question out of, if we want to support women, how about we equalize women in the workplace and we make this genuinely a decision of conscience. It's not a question of material support. This is the problem, is that we think of rights as these abstract questions outside of, this is the whole problem with bourgeois liberal democratic politics, is because, what are human rights, as Breht, mentioned, are treated as isolated, separate components outside of the social conditions in which choices are made. Like, you are not free to make, true freedom. You don't have freedom if you have to work for a living, in a low-paying job, and you can't afford to raise a child in the circumstances that they deserve as the human right of yourself, of the child, etc. Like, we just treat this as an abstract right. But if we had a real politics that was to support women's right to choose, it would be to give everybody the stable supports, the other human rights that they also have, and see this as a complex of conditions that work together. And that's the kind of politics that I think we need to have now if we're going to be confronting this issue, because the Supreme Court is going to go and make this precipitous move to erase this constitutional right, is that we have to fight in that class politics way to say we want a women's rights to choose, and we want every woman to be able to make that choice, not because they are under pressure, because they will never be able to get a career, they will never achieve their aspirations for an education, and because they have to, make this decision just out of the sense that it's financially not possible. We should be able to support everybody to make an appropriate choice for them and give them that possibility. That has material conditions, social conditions, as well as, these other kinds of abstract dimensions of choice. Choice isn't real if you are not allowed and not able to act without a sense of with independence. And so I think that's maybe the way in which we can broaden the effort and keep it from just being exploited in this isolated way that reinforces partisan established party politics to say you're for, you have to, vote for this terrible corporate Democrat because we need to fight for a woman's right to choose. Like, well, you've got to do more than just fight for that. Okay, in order to really get to achieve a solution here. I think that might be one of the things we need to do to reshape the dialogue and the discussion in response to what is definitely a disastrous, move. It is horrible. It's imperiling women, but we want to fight for women in every capacity, not as workers, as mothers, as in every capacity, and not just in this one. But we will not sacrifice this issue, but we want to expand the realm in which we think of women's rights. A real feminist agenda is supporting women in all of these aspects. We know that there's so many inequalities in the workplace. We know that women on average earn less. And so, and we know, the reasons why. We know that childcare, providing free, childcare, quality childcare, is one of the greatest things that we can do to support women. So let's do all of those things, and let's have a broad-based agenda here, in confronting the politics of the conservative right. There's the same reason why they're against all of those things too. Is because they have a patriarchal, politics of inequality. So we need to confront the entire agenda.
Yeah, I'm sorry to piggyback on that analysis. I think it's really good, and to reiterate that point, like, we have to tie the economic stuff with this thing, and we're not going to vote for a corporate Democrat because the economic policies that you create put women in these unforgiving, insufferable situations that are impossible to have any real choice. It's the same argument of like, well, you don't like your shitty low-wage job, you have the freedom to go choose another one. What? Go across the street to McDonald's instead of Burger King? It's the same shitty wages, same shitty pay. And that argument needs to be put on the forefront. And after we've kicked liberals down and beat their asses, we should also do it to the right, because what you see on the right is the rise of this new right, or the family oriented right. This argument that, we should be able to have a one income family. We got to support families and all this stuff. Okay. If you really believe that shit, then pursue policies that economically allow people to have families, to have kids. When you have an economy with inflation through the roof, historic levels of inequality, every working class person burdened to the gills with debt, student debt, credit card debt, car loan debt, you have an economy that is hostile in every way to regular working class people. Shut the fuck up about, I want to make this a country where we can have families again. Then back it up with economic policies. So both the corporate center of the Democratic Party and the right are complete fucking hypocrites on this issue. And what both of them do is try to, as Adnan said, divide and separate that larger economic discussion from this one and isolate it into a thing. And so both the liberals and the conservatives are 100% wrong here. And the conservatives are fully hypocritical, because when the Democrats abandon the working class, the Republicans are now trying to, through rhetoric, not through policy, appeal to the working class and try to pretend like we're the working class party now. But all they're going to do is criminalize abortion, not deal with any of the underlying issues of why families are dissolving, why people aren't being able to create families and have kids in a healthy, sustainable way. They're just as much hypocrites as anything else. And then I also want to give listeners some ammunition on this argument that's you've already seen and is going to continue to come your way, which is this is why the left should have voted for Hillary. We've already touched on some of those arguments, but let me make it very clear that is a shifting of their burden of responsibility. You know, Hillary lost not because a few people on the left didn't get behind her and vote for her. She lost because she was a historically terrible candidate that most Americans did not like, and they have dog shit policies that most Americans do not like. And you lost to one of the most cartoonish figures in American political history. It is not the fault of the left for not voting for your shitty candidate. It is the fault of you and your party for putting up such a shitty candidate. And so never, ever, ever let the liberal centrist and the Democratic Party hacks push the burden onto the left. This is the left's fault. Absolutely not. In every single way, as described for the last several minutes. This is a product of choices that the Democratic Party has made for years, coming home to roost finally. So shift that burden back onto them and say, I'm not playing this game where the left is the one that's to blame for this shit. Conservatives are the one doing it, and the liberals are the one that have for so long opportunistically allowed for it to happen and refused to address the economic situation that would make life easier for women in the first place. So yeah, don't deal with that at all.
You know, it's really strange that having a feminist icon like Hillary Clinton in a party that cares about women's right to choose more than anything, it's really strange that she chose an anti-abortion Democrat as her vice presidential candidate in 2016. Like, I don't know, that's totally baffling to me. I mean, feminist icon, right? Hillary Clinton, feminist icon. Maybe if I say it enough times, you know, it'll stick. Feminist icon, Hillary Clinton. Okay, I want to backtrack a little bit before we get to the closing out part here, which is, Breht, earlier you had mentioned class character of the people that are going to be affected by this. And I think that this is a critical point. We know that the people that are going to be disproportionately impacted by this are people that are in the lowest economic classes, and also particularly people that are from minority groups. And we not only know that because of, you know, logic, we also have seen this in historical instances where this has been basically the case where abortion wasn't legal. So let's look in the case of the United States before 1973. So of course, before 1973, Roe versus Wade was not in place. Abortion was illegal in most of the United States. However, just because abortion is illegal does not mean that women are not getting abortions. They are just getting unsafe abortions, right? They're going into a back alley. They're finding anybody who will be willing to give them an abortion at whatever cost they can afford and whatever the cost that the person will accept. And they're getting whatever the person is willing to do in order for the, you know, to get the pregnancy terminated. And in many cases, this ended up with women being sterilized, crippled, or dead. There is hundreds of thousands of women who, over, you know, the decades and the centuries, who were affected detrimentally, either through, you know, sterilization or death as a result of botched abortions. Why did these botched abortions happen before 1973? Because they were not legal. If they were legal, they would have had access to safe abortions, but they were not. And who are the women who are going to be desperate? Are the women who cannot, as Breht said, go to a different state, you know, pack up their bags, hop in their car, drive for a few hours, take a couple of days off of work, get their abortion, recuperate, and then drive back and, you know, act as if nothing was out of place. It is not the lowest class that is able to do this. So turning our focus back to pre-1973, women were having abortions. the just dangerous abortions. Now, I know many listeners are probably already aware of this, but there was an, I guess, organization, an informal organization, an underground organization, let's say, the Jane Collective. So I'm sure that many of our listeners have at least heard of the Jane Collective in passing. It started in Chicago. Essentially what it was is a group of people that were willing to perform abortions. So they had doctors, like actual doctors working with this organization. The organization would direct them to doctors who would be willing to perform abortions for women. Of course, it was totally illegal, but the results of this organization were that people that went through these channels to try to get a hold of Jane, right? Call Jane. When they called Jane and were put in contact with the doctors that were operating through them, the mortality was significantly lower. Like women were not being maimed or killed at the high rates that we were seeing in other forms of illegal abortion at the time. But the reason that I bring up Jane, the Jane Collective, is because what did Jane notice when they started operating their services, which were active between 1969 and 1972? They stopped when they were raided by the FBI and a bunch of the people, I believe FBI and local police, but a bunch of the people were arrested and sentenced to prison terms. But what did the doctors and the organizers of the Jane Collective notice about the people who were coming in? Almost universally, they were poor, and disproportionately, they were of minority background. This is because it was not illegal to have an abortion everywhere in the United States. And as Breht very rightly said earlier, the upper class women that, made a mistake, they got pregnant, they didn't want to carry the pregnancy to term, they had the ability to go to other places and have abortions legally. It is the lower class women who are disproportionately from minority backgrounds that were not able to do this. And the Jane Collective documented this very nicely. They showed, the people who are coming to us are all poor, not all, but almost all poor and disproportionately minority. If we're looking at today, we can see this as a historical paradigm, a period of time where there's large swaths of the country that abortion is not legal in. If Roe versus Wade is overturned, there will be, again, large portions of the United States where abortion is not legal, particularly in the South, as well as up in parts of the Midwest. In that case, we will see lower class women seeking abortions locally, illegally, because they cannot afford to do anything else. And when that happens, we are inevitably going to see an incredible increase in mortality among otherwise completely, normal, innocent girls just getting killed because they don't have that access to abortion because of this obscene decision. And then the only other thing that I want to mention before I turn it back over to you guys, and I guess we've been going for a while, so closing thoughts for each of us after I make this final point. Breht, you also mentioned that the Soviet Union was the first country that legalized abortion all the way back in 1920. It was one of the first things that they did, really. They were still fighting the Civil War at that point when they legalized abortion. But if we look globally, what do we see when we have socialist states or socialist parties governing states? We see that those states have the strongest abortion rights, and we see that they have earlier adoption of abortion rights when compared to other areas of geographical proximity and cultural background. Because, of course, if we're going to compare the Soviet Union in 1920 to, I don't know, like Chile in 1920, like what's the point of comparing these two contexts? It's more important to compare a socialist state in Eastern Europe to a capitalist state in Eastern Europe, or a socialist state in Latin America to a capitalist state in Latin America. Like, these are the sorts of comparisons that actually make sense. And when we make these sorts of comparisons, we see that almost universally, the socialist states and the socialist parties that govern states have stronger protections for abortion, and they have earlier adoption of rights of abortion. Pretty much the only exception that comes to mind is Ceausescu in Romania, who had absolutely draconian policies regarding abortion in an effort to boost the population of the country. I think that came in like 1966. And it went on for decades. Absolutely horrible policies there. But beyond that exception of Ceausescu, basically everywhere else, we see much better rights in the socialist countries compared to relatively similar countries in every other way besides the form of government that's governing the country. So I guess let's go around. Final thoughts. Breht, why don't you take it away?
Sure. Just to add to that is, like, not only was the socialist states the most progressive in the actual legalization of the act itself, but also they did exactly what me and Adnan were just talking about, which is also provide that broader network of social and economic policies that help women become more independent. We've talked about that on Rev Left with Kristen Godsey, the ethnographer of Eastern Europe, and talked about how women in particular flourished under socialist states, even imperfect ones, and how the reentrance of capitalism and the destruction of those social and the privatization of those social services devastated women in those areas after the fall of socialism. So that's important too. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention really quick as my sort of final thing to say is, not only, as Henry is saying, are these tragedies of women losing their lives, of abortions being pushed underground going to happen, and all of the health implications that has, there's also, as we've seen with some of these prelude laws, like in Texas, this brutal criminalization of women as well. So those that don't die, those that don't get bodily damage or whatever, are still going to run the risk of being ratted out by their pro-life neighbor, or their conservative uncle, or whoever the fuck, and then maybe have to face prison sentences. So you are destabilizing life for women, really making it hard on every level just to exist. And have control over your own body and your own life. So not only do you have to worry again about the health implications, but the carceral and criminal implications of these acts are going to be ratcheted up, because nothing that the reactionaries like more is to see people they don't like suffer. And women who go out and try to get abortions are going to, if they survive, are going to be thrown into a prison cell if the right has their full choice on the matter. And so that should be woven into the calculus as well.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add on that. Breht and you both made, I think, some key points. All I would say is just further extending the last thing Breht was saying about the cruelty that's involved here is a conscious cruelty. Modern far-right politics actually takes pleasure in the pain of others. This is the most reactionary, anti-human, anti-compassion kind of politics. And it gives the lie to many who tried to walk back or, where Trump said, out loud what is known in the movement by just talking about the legal consequences of the policy positions that they hold. He said during the campaign, that, perhaps, women who do have, abortions, if we make it illegal, should face, consequences, legal consequences. And we're seeing this coming into law in the laws that you were just talking about in Texas. These kinds of movements to criminalize, women protecting, their rights, making difficult choices. And that's just indicative, it seems to me, of the whole overall politics that we have to stand against. We are for life. We're for good lives being lived the way that they should be, with dignity, with respect, with social supports, so that we can all flourish and achieve our potential. That's what we stand for. And I think it's the cruelty that is so disturbing to see. But we've seen it in every aspect of their politics. Look at what, the kids in camps, at the border. This was paraded in front of them. They took joy in some sense out of seeing this. It was a politics of cruelty. Now, let's blame the liberals, that they've done nothing to dismantle, ICE and, the horrible situation at the border. They just try and ignore it, when it's inconvenient politically. But there is the far right actually takes joy out of witnessing the pain of those they disagree with. This is disgusting, and we have to put a stop to it. But it's not going to happen just by, falling in line, as we've been discussing, with liberal bourgeois style imagining of political rights. We need a social program of transformation that encompasses us all in our full human selves, in our social realities, men, women, Black, brown, and so forth. So I don't really have anything specific further to say on this. I think the agenda is clear. We've got a fight on our hands, but this is the fight, that we're going to have to embrace. And it's not the fight of liberal corporate, democratic establishment. It is the social basis for true revolutionary and radical politics that is happening, really democratize our society. So let's get ready. This is going to be a fight.
Yeah, love that from both of you guys. I don't have anything else that I really want to say because I feel like I've been less articulate than usual, which is really saying something because I am so filled with rage right now. Like it's taking every fiber of my being to not just explode right now. But if I exploded, the listeners would have a very, very ugly recording on their hands. So I've done what I can to keep myself somewhat in check. What I will say before we do the readout is that what can we do about this? Do not donate to the Democratic Party. That's what you're going to see. We talked about fundraising. See, I'm starting to explode already. Okay, calm down, Henry. Do not donate to the Democratic Party. When Nancy Pelosi sends you an email saying, look, we're the Democrats. We stand for abortion rights. Send us money so that we can protect you and your rights. The Democrats have had the opportunity to do so for decades, and they've done nothing. They're using this cynically as a ploy in order to get more money into their party's pockets. We'll be diplomatic and saying to their party's pockets. But don't donate to the Democrats. Don't donate to anything that's affiliated with the Democrats. The Democrats have had their chance. They're not the ones that are going to be making the difference in this right now. What we can do right now, because it looks almost certain that Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned right now, right? It hasn't officially been done yet because this is just a draft, but it is upcoming, right? This official decision is upcoming. What we can do is not rely on the Democrats. The Democrats have the House, they have the Senate, they have the presidency, but they can't do anything about it right now. Their time has come and gone. What we need to do is to raise hell in whatever way that we can, wherever you are. So my opportunity to do so is pretty limited. I'm living in Russia, where even though it's a super conservative socially, and also pretty economically as well, a very conservative country, the right to abortion is really, really strong here. Like basically the only impediment to you getting an abortion here is you have to listen to a very old conservative woman scolding you in a consultation before you get your abortion done. Like that's literally the only impediment to abortion here. There's not much I can do. Like what? I go out into the streets in the middle of Kazan, Russia and say, darn you, US, what are you doing? Like I can't do that. Look where you are. Look for organizations that have strategies in place for what they can do materially, both within your community as well as activism to get the word out outside of your community. Band together with these organizations and do your part. I'm doing what I can here, but I'm limited. Do not donate to the Democratic Party. Let me reiterate that point one more time. Find something that you can actually do in the real world to raise hell and let everyone know what you're feeling. Because that is the only way that there is going to be any sort of sea change. This decision, the time for blocking it is come and gone. But we have to raise hell now in order for the counteroffensive that we must make in the near future. So that's my attempt at maintaining somewhat diplomatic tenor. We'll see how the listeners respond to that. Anyway, Breht, how can the listeners find you and all of the excellent work that you are doing on all of your podcasts? And I will mention that your local NPR affiliate interview that you did recently was excellent. The listeners really need to check that out.
Thank you. Yeah, for everything I do, you can go to revolutionaryleftradio.com. And that has everything that we absolutely do. And, this is a scary time. So I just want to send, heartfelt love and solidarity to everybody out there who is worried about the new precarity that's going to be forced upon them and into their life. The only way that we can get through this is with solidarity, with sticking together. And I hope to see that the left really can rise to the moment. Because if we can't do it now, when the fuck are we going to be able to do it? So love and solidarity to everybody out there.
Adnan, how can the listeners find you and your other podcasts that you do?
Well, you can follow me on Twitter at Adnan A. Husain, and also check out the Majlis podcast, Majlis.
And I highly recommend the listeners to do that. Adnan, what do you have coming up on the Majlis? Do you know what the next episode will be about yet?
We've got a couple of episodes upcoming. I think maybe one of interest to people will be about Urdu poetry and culture. People may have noticed Pakistan has been somewhat in the news because of recent tumult in their electoral situation. The president lost his majority, and Imran Khan, a populist sort of anti-imperial figure with problems, but and there are lots of massive protests right now taking place, and there have been allegations of U.S. interference in their election or in their political process. So people might be interested to learn a little bit more about Pakistan that you might not know very much about, Urdu poetry and culture.
Looking forward to that. As for me, listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Huck1995, HUCK1995. You can follow the show on Twitter. We've been putting out some interesting things on there by going to at gorilla_pod, GUERRILLA_pod. And well, I just was complaining about asking people for money. So you can donate to us if you want at patreon.com/gorilla history, but don't think that that's solving the problem. That's my caveat for this episode. You can support the show at patreon.com/gorilla history, but we don't do this for the money, and donating the money to this program is not going to be what we need to do. You need to get out and raise hell wherever you are. So on that note, listeners, solidarity.